Book 1, Chapter 1, Part 2 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alan Winterroud. Armadale by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 1, Part 2. He found Mrs. Armadale suffering under violent nervous agitation, caused entirely by a recent interview with her son. Allan had been sitting with her all the morning, and had talked of nothing but his new friend. The man with the horrible name, as poor Mrs. Armadale described him, had questioned Allan, in a singularly inquisitive manner, on the subject of himself and his family, but had kept his own personal history entirely in the dark. At some former period of his life he had been accustomed to the sea and to sailing. Allan had unfortunately found this out, and a bond of union between them was formed on the spot. With a merciless distrust of the stranger, simply because he was a stranger, which appeared rather unreasonable to Mr. Brock, Mrs. Armadale besought the rector to go to the inn without a moment's loss of time, and never to rest until he had made the man give a proper account of himself. "Find out everything about his father and mother," she said, in her vehement female way. "Make sure before you leave him that he is not a vagabond roaming the country under an assumed name." "My dear lady," remonstrated the rector, obediently taking his hat, "whatever else we may doubt, I really think we may feel sure about the man's name. It is so remarkably ugly that it must be genuine. No sane human being would assume such a name as Ozias Midwinter." "You may be quite right, and I may be quite wrong, but pray go and see him," persisted Mrs. Armadale. "Go, and don't spare him, Mr. Brock. How do we know that this illness of his may not have been put on for a purpose?" It was useless to reason with her. The whole College of Physicians might have certified to the man's illness, and in her present frame of mind Mrs. Armadale would have disbelieved the college, one and all, from the president downward. Mr. Brock took the wise way out of the difficulty. He said no more, and he set off for the inn immediately. Ozias Midwinter, recovering from brain fever, was a startling object to contemplate on a first view of him. His shaven head, tied up in an old yellow silk handkerchief, his tawny, haggard cheeks, his bright brown eyes, preternaturally large and wild, his rough black beard, his long, supple, sinewy fingers, wasted by suffering till they looked like claws, all tended to discompose the rector at the outset of the interview. When the first feeling of surprise had worn off, the impression that followed it was not an agreeable one. Mr. Brock could not conceal from himself that the stranger's manner was against him. The general opinion had settled that, if a man is honest, he is bound to assert it by looking straight at his fellow creatures when he speaks to them. If this man was honest, his eyes showed a singular perversity in looking away and denying it. Possibly they were affected in some degree by a nervous restlessness in his organization, which appeared to pervade every fiber in his lean, lithe body. The rector's healthy Anglo-Saxon flesh crept responsively at every casual movement of the usher's supple brown fingers, and every passing distortion of the usher's haggard yellow face. "God forgive me," thought Mr. Brock, with his mind running on Allan and Allan's mother. "I wish I could see my way to turning Ozias Midwinter adrift in the world again." The conversation which ensued between the two was a very guarded one. Mr. Brock felt his way gently, and found himself, try where he might, always kept politely more or less in the dark. From first to last, the man's real character shrank back with a savage shyness from the rector's touch. He started by an assertion which it was impossible to look at him and believe. He declared that he was only 20 years of age. All he could be persuaded to say on the subject of the school was that the bare recollection of it was horrible to him. He had only filled the usher's situation for 10 days, when the first appearance of his illness caused his dismissal. How he had reached the field in which he had been found was more than he could say. He remembered traveling a long distance by railway, with a purpose, if he had a purpose, which it was now impossible to recall, and then wandering coastward on foot all through the day, or all through the night, he was not sure which. The sea kept running in his mind when his mind began to give way. He had been employed on the sea as a lad. He had left it, and had filled a situation at a bookseller's in a country town. He had left the bookseller's, and had tried the school. Now the school had turned him out, he must try something else. It mattered little what he tried. Failure, for which nobody was ever to blame but himself, was sure to be the end of it sooner or later. Friends to assist him he had none to apply to, and as for relations, he wished to be excused from speaking of them. For all he knew they might be dead, and for all they knew he might be dead. That was a melancholy acknowledgment to make at his time of life, there was no denying it. It might tell against him in the opinion of others, and it did tell against him, no doubt, in the opinion of the gentleman who was talking to him at that moment. These strange answers were given in a tone and manner far removed from bitterness on the one side, or from indifference on the other. Ozias Midwinter at 20 spoke of his life as Ozias Midwinter at 70 might have spoken with a long weariness of years on him which he had learned to bear patiently. Two circumstances pleaded strongly against the distrust with which, in sheer perplexity of mind, Mr. Brock blindly regarded him. He had written to a savings bank in a distant part of England, had drawn his money, and had paid the doctor and the landlord. A man of vulgar mind, after acting in this manner, would have treated his obligations lightly when he had settled his bills. Ozias Midwinter spoke of his obligations, and especially of his obligation to Allan, with a fervor of thankfulness which it was not surprising only, but absolutely painful to witness. He showed a horrible sincerity of astonishment at having been treated with common Christian kindness in a Christian land. He spoke of Allan's having become answerable for all the expenses of sheltering, nursing, and curing him, with a savage rapture of gratitude and surprise which burst out of him like a flash of lightning. "So help me God!" cried the castaway usher. "I never met with the like of him. I never heard of the like of him before." In the next instant, the one glimpse of light which the man had let in on his own passionate nature was quenched again in darkness. His wandering eyes, returning to their old trick, looked uneasily away from Mr. Brock, and his voice dropped back once more into its unnatural steadiness and quietness of tone. "I beg your pardon, sir," he said. "I have been used to be hunted and cheated and starved. Everything else comes strange to me." Half attracted by the man, half repelled by him, Mr. Brock, on rising to take leave, impulsively offered his hand, and then, with a sudden misgiving, confusedly drew it back again. "You meant that kindly, sir," said Ozias Midwinter, with his own hands crossed resolutely behind him. "I don't complain of your thinking better of it. A man who can't give a proper account of himself is not a man for a gentleman in your position to take by the hand." Mr. Brock left the inn thoroughly puzzled. Before returning to Mrs. Armadale, he sent for her son. The chances were that the guard had been off the stranger's tongue when he spoke to Allan, and with Allan's frankness there was no fear of his concealing anything that had passed between them from the rector's knowledge. Here again Mr. Brock's diplomacy achieved no useful results. Once started on the subject of Ozias Midwinter, Allan rattled on about his new friend in his usual easy, light-hearted way. But he had really nothing of importance to tell, for nothing of importance had been revealed to him. They had talked about boat-building and sailing by the hour together, and Allan had got some valuable hints. They had discussed, with diagrams to assist them, and with more valuable hints for Allan, the serious impending question of the launch of the yacht. On other occasions they had diverged to other subjects, to more of them than Allan could remember on the spur of the moment. Had Midwinter said nothing about his relations in the flow of all this friendly talk? Nothing, except that they had not behaved well to him. Hang his relations! Was he at all sensitive on the subject of his own odd name? Not the least in the world. He had set the example, like a sensible fellow, of laughing at it himself. Mr. Brock still persisted. He inquired next what Allan had seen in the stranger